My message is God cares this morning. And some may doubt that God cares. When you read Psalm 10, you find an interesting chapter that talks about the attitude of those who reject God in their lives, the wicked, who say, there is no God to care, to see his rotten behavior, or to do anything about it. Sometimes people have doubted God's existence because of the harsh things that happen in this world. Einstein believed in God, but he said he believed in Spinoza's God, if you know who that philosopher was, Jewish philosopher. Einstein believed in some kind of a pantheistic God who wasn't personal, who really didn't care about human beings. And Charles Darwin, got to think the same way. Because he saw nature as very harsh and mean, how could there be a God who cares with all the blood and guts that are in nature going on? And Darwin had a young daughter who died, like 10 or 11 years old. And that just crushed him. And he thought there can't be a personal God who cares. That's what Darwin came to think. And what did Job think when he lost his family, except his wife, when he lost all his children, when he got his disease? What did he think? He began to wonder, where are you, God? What are you doing? He didn't doubt the existence of God, but he did doubt God's personal interest in his life. But of course, when you learn the story of Job, you learn that God was very interested in Job's life, just like he's interested in your life, in a very personal way. Several years ago, Randy and his family had a son that was college age. He and his brother were riding their four-wheelers on the farm. A neighbor was cutting a great big tree, but the tree wouldn't fall. So the neighbor put his saw down, went into the house, and Randy's two sons rode their four-wheelers around the farm, and they came close to that tree. And that big tree fell on their youngest son, Robert, and crushed him and killed him. If there's anybody that I think is like Job, it's Randy Wolf, my good friend. But he didn't doubt God. And he didn't doubt God's care. In Psalm 10, it says, O Lord, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to vindicate the orphan and the oppressed, so that man who is of the earth will no longer cause terror. And so the psalmist realized that, yes, there is a God, and he will deal with those with the rotten behavior who think that God won't do anything about it. Well, when we look at the life of Christ, we see God who cared. When he goes to the well and the Samaritan woman's there, Jesus cares about her. He cares about her spiritual health. And he helps to convince her that he is the Messiah. And she goes into the village and tells everybody, and she's all excited. And the whole town gets excited that Jesus, the Messiah, is here. But the Jews wouldn't have anything to do with the Samaritans. But Jesus had something to do with the woman who was a Samaritan in John 4. The centurion who was a Gentile, Jesus cared about him and healing his servant. And the widow of Nain, who was a Gentile, Jesus cared about her and her son who had died, and he raised that son from the dead. Jesus cared about the sinful woman in Luke chapter 7 who wiped his feet with her hair and her tears, and he forgave her of her sins. Jesus cared about that little fellow Zacchaeus who was up in the tree who was a tax gatherer, the tax collector that everybody hated. Jesus cared for him. And when Jesus came to the scene where Lazarus had died, and Mary and Martha were grieving, and there were others there grieving with them, what did Jesus do? He was moved in his spirit. And verse 35, is it? The shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. You talk about God caring. Look at God caring in John chapter 11. He cared. All these cases. The word compassion in the New Testament is an interesting word. I think there's 14 letters in that Greek word. Do you see that big old word up there? You see that big old word? You don't see the one back here. I do. Look at that. Say that, Mark. Where you at? That's a big old word, is it? To be moved with compassion, to yearn with compassion, is frequently recorded of Christ towards the multitude and towards the individual. Look at all those verses about Jesus having compassion. Look at that. Does God care? Jesus, God, showed that he cared. And he cares about you. If you're with us this morning and you're not a Christian, please realize that there is a God who cares about your life. And there are people here who care about your life and would be a help and encouragement to you in your life. Realize that. And of course, here's a verse that everybody knows that certainly tells us that God cares. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. What verse is that? John 3:16, of course. God cared enough to give his Son so that we might live. God cared enough to give us the Scriptures, the Bible, giving evidence of his love and his plans for us. God cared enough to give us grace, even though we don't deserve that grace. God cared enough to forgive us and set us free from guilt and shame. God cared enough to give us hope in an often harsh and hurting world. And so in the Lord's Supper, we think of the death of Jesus Christ, who gave his life for our salvation. And we see clearly in this historical event that our God is a God who cares for us in an immeasurable way. You can't measure it. It's so great. So today, thank God for his loving care as you partake the Lord's Supper.